Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Security Repo Podcast. We have an awesome episode this week starring Kent McDonough, and I'm joined, as usual these days, by my co-host, Hazar, and I am Dwayne, and let's just dive right into it. So, Kent comes to us, he got his MS in computer science from Virginia Tech back in 2021, not that long ago, with a focus on systems and networking. He currently does security automation for Viasat, a global satellite internet service provider. He's got an emphasis on credential management and RBAC systems, which is something we're very interested in as well, handling this problem of credential management, especially machine to machine. So welcome to the program.
Hello. Nice to meet you guys.
So let's kind of just dive right in. This problem set of credentials management, this machine identity, then I guess human identities as well. Why this topic? How did you get interested in this problem space?
So I'm going to rewind a few years. In 2020, during the pandemic, I was interning with Viasat. I interned with them a few times, but I was going to grad school. We converted like a full, I ended up doing another internship kind of unexpectedly. And I kind of oopsed into this problem, right? I switched teams that I was working with, and the big topic at that time was credential management, right? How do we audit the age of our credentials? How do we understand what we're using? How do we manage them, right? So like I started with this intern project to kind of audit credentials and understand, how they're being used. And that grew into a larger discussion about, okay, now that we understand what we have and how old it is, how do we start rotating it, right? And doing this management. So I just kind of kept picking at this problem as I rolled from an intern into a full-time employee. And I was kind of, not only was it technically challenging, right, to enumerate all the stuff we were using and, figure out how to actually write the code to rotate it, right, and how to do it safely and cover all the edge cases, but I started getting a little bit of pushback from traditional software teams, right, all of which are great people, but we got a lot of questions about, why are we doing this, right, what was wrong with our old approach, this is hard, we keep having problems, so I had an opportunity to kind of be like a disruptor, right? And say, okay, this is important. We need to do this. If your software doesn't handle it, right, this is a defect that we should address, right? So it was this intersection of system engineering, security, risk reduction, application development, right? And it struck gold for me, right? I really enjoyed it, and I still work on it today.
Hey, Kenton, just to give our audience a bit more context into the work you've been doing at Viasat, can you maybe tell us, what sort of systems did you have? Did you have like old Java-based applications that were 20 years old? Do you have like very modern Go-based stuff? What's the setup like at Viasat?
Right. Yeah. So whenever I've described this to people who have asked similar questions, especially like new hires, I mean, you name it, we've got it somewhere, right? The company has been in business for a long time, and we're constantly innovating. So there's always a mix of old, legacy applications in all different kinds of languages, new shiny stuff that people are working on, right? A lot of commercial code, right? We have a lot of platforms that are industry standards, right? Like we have Okta, we have standalone LDAP servers, right? We've got custom APIs that we put on top of things. Literally, if it's, mildly interesting to somebody, right? We've got it somewhere, and it's not in use in every system, right? But the amount of integrations is just staggering, right? And I imagine it's the same for a lot of software companies that have done the same type of evolution over time, where they've either changed businesses or, they innovate, right? But we can't totally leave everything behind. So yeah, the amount of different types of credentials, the variety out there is just very high.
Right. So it seems like that you've got so many different technologies in your Viasat setup. So did you maybe choose a few applications to test your new credential rotation mechanisms, or did you go all in on all the applications? What was your strategy there?
Right. So we realized pretty early on that if we were just going to rotate a service account, right? I find one and I say, hey, I want to change this, right? That was probably going to be disruptive, right, to the teams that were working on that if they weren't ready. So there was a long coordination period there, but just to even test our pipelines, right, we had to set up, dummy credentials, right? So we picked out a few different types of, this type of service account or this type of API key, right? Made a total dummy set, right? Put that into a secrets manager and just, proofed pipelines, right? Can I rotate this thing without any side effects? And then once we were confident that our pipelines worked out good, we started working with application teams to say, okay, can you get me a test deployment set up that's isolated that we can, run this and see what happens, right? And then we escalate to, okay, let's, try doing this with more replicas, right? Did we consider all of the different environments in prod, right? What kind of test bed can we get set up? And over time, it took a little bit to get really mature at it, but over time, we've gotten quite good at it.
I'm just curious because we always love horror stories on this channel on the show. What went wrong? What if you can share some of the things that you learned along the way, like what not to do, maybe some warnings for our audience that might be on this path themselves.
Right. So one thing I can say is that almost all of the problems that we run into are some variant of a synchronization issue, right? So if I have 30 different developers that are all running a slightly different configuration of an app as part of, a sandbox or a test bed that they've got set up, right? And I make a rotation, I try to change something in the environment, right? There are going to be ripple effects, right? If those applications are linked together in ways that, aren't clear, right? If they're all using the same service account, right? Which one of the things I talked about at BSides in my presentation, or, they all happen to be running on the same node, right? A very beefy VM, and you change the certificate, right? There's going to be unexpected consequences. So almost always the problems turn out to be, well, we missed some setup that we didn't know about, that didn't get the memo about the new credential, and now it's, spamming error logs somewhere, right? Or it's, firing off network requests that we ddidn't know about. And there's an initial like, hey, does anyone know what this is, right? So there's a lot of like forensics that go into kind of finding that stuff out, or you get a call from somebody that says, hey, why is your app attacking my API, right? So that's all very surface level stuff. I can say there are some very like insidious things that we've run into, especially with the COTS software, where credential management just doesn't work the way you would think it does. So like for example, we rotated an API key one time, right? So I call an API for an on-premises, a platform that we have running. It doesn't really matter what it is. So I make a call in to change a credential, right? I get back the new one, I put it in my secret manager. If that application that has the API key, if it crashes, right, and it rolls back its auth database, this happened to us one time where like right after we did it, it crashed and it rolled back. Suddenly everyone's screaming like, hey, why doesn't this work anymore, right? And it wasn't the problem with the secret manager. Like we got the updated secret, but the thing that was supposed to take it decided to ignore, like forget about it, right? So like that was the thing. There was another case one time where we made a call, like very similar scenario. We made a call in to like rotate a secret, right? And we wait for like 10 seconds or 50 seconds or a minute or whatever it is. We ended up retrying the request because we didn't get a response back in time, right? In the time when we made the retry, the original response came back, but our retry request still went out, right? So we actually made 2 requests to rotate the password, but the first one came back. We forgot about the second one. We wrote the new what we thought was the new password in, and then there was an invisible change that was made in the background, right? Just due to how the network was like, buffering requests at the time. So all kinds of really insidious stuff that you can get into when you get down into the weeds, but it always boils down to somebody doesn't have the right password, right? Or the right certificate or the right token or something, right? And whatever ripple effects that causes.
Definitely break the access because, well, that's the whole point of those keys. If you don't have the right key, you ain't going to get in.
Exactly.
Sounds like you've broken quite a few things at Viasat. Can you maybe tell us how do you manage with the fallback of all of this? Like you've got agri teams shouting at you. Does that really happen? How do you deal with these frustrations that people might have because you're introducing these changes and possibly breaking production?
Right. So I will clarify that we're very good to have a robust test setup, right? So there are multiple layers of testing here. So typically we go through like a feature integration, right, where we try out on a version of the credentials that are neutered, right, or they're not used for the production systems, right? Or we'll start in a dev setup with like one engineer, then we scale up to the feature integration section, then do a pre-prod deployment, right? And if anything goes wrong there, right, we run those rotations pretty frequently. Right. So that if there's a bug that gets introduced in the software, even after we've tested, okay, this rotation works, we've done this like 15, 20 times, right? We're confident it goes well. We don't stop, right? We keep doing it. So if a bug comes in for credential management, right, we catch it real quick, right? And then, that problematic build doesn't get promoted. But the biggest thing that we did when we first started this, right, and I mentioned there was a lot of concern, pushback. People are concerned about scheduling, right? Are you doing this in the middle of the night, right? How do I respond quickly? We listened to the developers, right, who told us, hey, today is not a good day, right? I'm working on an integration, right, and I need this to be stable, right? You can't wreck this for me today, right? Or someone's making a change, right, and they say, I want to test this, right? I'm changing my credential management. I want to test this without an unexpected surprise, right? Can we halt, everything that you're doing for a little bit so I can work this out? We'll get a new build out, right, and play around with this. We also did a lot of in the beginning just evangelization of like, hey, let's at our weekly kind of stand-ups, let's talk about credentials, right? Let's talk about, here's a type of credential that pretty much everyone is using for this purpose, right? Did you know that you have this? If you didn't know that you had this, you do, right? It's part of your environment, right? You need to know how this works, right? And then I actually got my hands into the code, right? So when we were doing a lot of the initial testing, right, we'd find a library that had some problem, right? And instead of just the security team kicking it over to the app team and saying, hey, fix this, please, I got in and said, hey, let me write you a PR, right? Let's look at this together. And that, the conversation that came out of that between the developers and us about, what is reasonable, what isn't reasonable, what's good software engineering, what's not good software engineering, right? That kind of blossomed and took hold into we really changed our organization's culture from, don't bother me, don't worry about it, to maybe I should be concerned about this, right? Maybe we should ask, when we're writing these things from scratch, what the assumptions should be, right? What are the credentials going to look like? How do they change? And the results have been really, really good.
Sounds like quite an involved effort. In terms of timelines, what can you tell us? What sort of time does it take for you to move one app from the old system to the new system? Is it 2 months, 3 months?
It's really depended. I don't think I can give you a straight up answer. Some relatively simple apps have been very easy to convert, and some of them, we still tweak, right? Occasionally, where we find a bug with the way that we're managing a credential, or a very specific shutdown case, right, where something gets messed up, or we do an upgrade to a different part of the environment, right, or we change a network condition, right, and then something new pops up, right? So it's not just a one and done. It's a continuous process, right, that we have to monitor. And like I said, we've gotten over the past few years, we've gotten rather good at it, and things have come up, right? We get questions like, hey, I didn't know the secret was being changed, right? Can you give me a heads up, right? Or can you get an alert to my Slack channel, or I'd like an email or something, right? So we've kind of built out a tool set of, what do people want to know, right? We get asked enough times, can I see a dashboard? It's well, I'll build you a dashboard, right? Let's ship you some metrics, right? About how often your credentials are changing, how old they are, right? What we're doing before we do it, right? That type of thing.
And that's great. And that's something I think everybody needs to hear, is that it does take a culture change. It takes a mindset change, and that raising that awareness is step one, but giving people the tools they need so they can get it done. I think that's a missing component in so many conversations around security. We say you're doing it wrong, but how many of us are really taking the time to say, how do you do it right, and give you the tools so you can be successful? But I want to dig in a little more technical on all of this for the people that do want to go down that path. They're already bought in. They want to get this. And let's talk about the various ways we can get this done. So one of the big takeaways I had from your talk back at BSides Vegas was the idea of a push versus a pull model for secrets. And wonder if we could just start there, and why are people doing it either way?
Sure. So I'll start by saying I'm going to present these kind of in, we like the pull model better, right? But that doesn't mean that the push model is useless, right? There are cases for both of them. So the push model is probably what most people start with when they deploy an app for the first time, which is they have some amount of secrets. It doesn't matter where they are, right? In a very, very naive organization, you might have them cooked into your source control, right? Or, baked into an AWS config or something, right? But the idea is that when you deploy your app, you have this set of credentials that go along with the app, right? Either as part of an environment variable or a config, or, somewhere you're saying, here's some strings, right? Put these into the environment the same way I'm putting my source code, right? And when I say start, right, the source code is going to read those from an environment variable or a config file or something, right? But the idea is that the credentials are kind of packaged together with the app, and maybe you can change them, without changing the app, but you have to, press a button and say, push this out, right? In contrast, a pull model is where you deploy an app, right? And instead of sending it secrets that you want it to use, you give it a way to talk to your secrets manager. That, and depending on your app environment, that could be like a Kubernetes proxy service that, like, you can contact to ask for certain vault secrets, or that prepositions vault secrets for you, right? Based on a configuration file you've given it. They're pulling them from the secret manager and putting them on the cluster. Or it could just be like a straight up, like I'll use HashiCorp Vault as an example because it's got a pretty good market share, like a vault library, right? That goes into your code. You give it a config file that says, read a secret from this path, and then here's the data that I want you to pull out of inside of it. And the app starts up, it authenticates to Vault, right? It actually does some type of authentication mechanism using a token that it can retrieve from its environment, or, a credential somehow that it needs to start with. There's a bootstrapping exchange, but it talks to the secret manager and then it pulls down what it needs. And the distinction there is that in a push model, the app doesn't update the credentials itself. You have to tell it, here are new credentials, please use them. In a pull model, the app has the ability to pull down new credentials whenever it wants. So it can start paying attention to things like, hey, that password that I started with doesn't work anymore. I should probably go get a new one from the secret manager, right? Instead of just, crashing or floundering, right? Or entering a failed state and waiting for someone to come, rehabilitate it, right? You get this self-recovery mechanism.
That's very interesting. You spoke earlier about what's good software engineering, what's good engineering excellence, and I can't stop myself from thinking, when the app itself is starting to think logically about if my secret's working well, if I should change it, doesn't that break the separation of duties, in your opinion?
It does, right? So you have to, that's why I said that not all cases do you want that pull model, right? It's not always judicious. So I'll give you an example. If you have a really high throughput data transfer app, right, that is doing, managing tons and tons of network connections, right, and all of them are very critical that they need to be up, small disruptions, right, to your either the network, right, or the authentication mechanism, right, talk about like network entry for a device, right, where round trip time like is really important. If you have to keep redoing auth handshakes and stuff, right, you're eating into consumer time, increasing latency, losing money, right? That app might need a stronger guarantee that the credentials that you've given it are good and they're not going to change in the middle of it, right? Because now that app has a lot more work to do to recover, right? And the recovery costs a lot more money than, like a API gateway, right? You're calling into the API that is calling another API on your behalf. If you can wait, the milliseconds for like a buffer, if, you need to do a credential refresh, right? That's a lot. It's a lot easier on everybody if those apps just kind of take care of themselves because they don't have those ridiculous constraints than your high throughput networking app, right? That every microsecond counts, right? So you have to be judicious about where those lines are drawn based on your app. But in the general case, right, there's this concept of, like I said, recoverability, right? If something happens, right, like, take a TCP connection, right? If the network goes down, right, in the middle of a TCP connection, TCP has protocols built into it that you can recover, right? You can redo a handshake, right? Depending on what version of TCP you're using, or TLS, whatever. You don't even need the whole handshake anymore, right? You can kind of start where you left off. You can survive a disruption without having to go in and kick the thing and restart, right? And we just take that for granted at the operating system level, right? The operating system takes care of that. The app doesn't have to worry about it. I think it's a very similar parallel to say, if a credential changes, right, some apps, I want them to just take care of it, right? I don't want to have to go and poke every one of them individually and guarantee. I just want to know that they're going to recover and they'll do it in a reasonable amount of time. So if that's desirable to you in a system, right, then I think this is the best way to go about it, is building that assumption in, right, that your app needs to, recover itself.
Well, this goes directly into the other thing that really struck me from your talk in Vegas, which was the idea of implementing blue-green deployment for secrets. And that's not something that I've heard anybody talk about yet. The idea of auto-rotating secrets, yes, we're all about that here.
Mm-hmm.
You auto-rotate with Vault. But I really hadn't considered like that edge case, not even an edge case, but that reality of, I'm trying the old secret, it didn't work. What do I do now? And trying to deal with that at a function level, at a application level. So can you talk a little bit about how you designed that and like how you defined success with that at Viasat?
Yeah. So There's different ways you can implement this, and I assume most people are familiar with the blue-green deployment concept for apps, right? You have a new feature that you're rolling out. You roll out the new one, but you don't take down the old one, right? So they both work. You have an opportunity to test both. Once you're happy with the new one, you can start phasing out the old one, right? So if you have 10 deployments that are on blue, you bring up another 10 that are on green or 5 or whatever it is, and then you start switching your traffic over. Once you're happy that green is functioning the way you want, you can start taking down blue. For secrets, it kind of works the same way. So when we talk about blue-green, I almost always think of a push model because I'm instructing the app. I want you to use blue versus I want you to use green. You could construe this different ways. You could have the app start with both and choose one, right? Or know how to switch between them, right? It's whatever makes sense for your app. But yeah, the idea is that you actually have two credentials that are, for all purposes, identical, right? But they're distinct in that you can change one without invalidating the other, right? So API keys are a good example of this. If you have, let's use GitHub as an example, right? You can have as many pats as you want for an account, and they can be functionally identical, right? They all have the same claims and everything. So if you want to start rotating the pat that you have, you make a new one, right? Or you already have a new one on standby that's identical, valid for all the same things, and you start distributing that to all the places that you know it's used, right? So once you're confident that the old one has been replaced by the identical one, the blue has been replaced by the green in all the places that it's being used, then you can destroy blue, right? Or regenerate it or do whatever it is you're going to do with it. The trick there is knowing how many places it's actually used, right? A blue-green deployment only works if you can accurately track how the blue, or you need to track where the old one is being used from, so you know whether or not you're done, right? It's that definition of doneness, because if you miss one, right, and then you move forward and invalidate it, well, you're taking something offline, you're going to break something, right? So different systems have different levels of support for this. I've found, like, I think GitHub and some others are pretty good. You can extract from logs, like, which credential is being used. They have fingerprints. You can tell which one of the two is being used at which locations. For sure that you've filtered out the last one, right, when you've gone like 6 hours without it seeing it be used or something. Other systems are much more opaque, right? There's no way to like mine out, which particular credential is being used. And you just have to have a really good org to know, I think I got them all, right? And be confident pressing the, I'm done button and actually invalidating the old one. So that, in general, I don't recommend this unless you know that you need it, right? If you have one of those very latency sensitive applications where you need to bring up new ones before you can take down old ones, or that you have that data where you can track the usage so that you're done, right? Because there's always that what if about, well, I waited 6 hours and I haven't seen the old one. Am I done? Or do I just have one that's offline that hasn't come back on? I have a spare in my node pool, right, that's still got this thing that I don't know about because it's not active, right? It starts, it's hard to build that confidence. So start there. If you're thinking this approach, how do you define your doneness? And then kind of walk back to the actual technical, how do you actually do the swap?
This blue-green strategy, in my opinion, raises a difficult engineering problem. Secret revocation, time to live, TTLs. Mm-hmm. How do you manage these TTLs in a case where you've got multiple secrets that are concurrently available for the same app? Do you just say all my secrets have a fixed time to live and they will all disappear in like 2 days, 3 days? Or do you have something that watches the secret, see if it's used, and if it's not used, that kills it? How do you manage that?
Right. So there's a couple of different ways you can handle this. One thing that I would definitely recommend is where we actually started when we began this journey at Viasat, was just an auditor program, right? Just to keep track of what was being used. So like I said, we use Vault, right? But any secret manager should have this. We just have an auditor program that just keeps track of how much stuff do we have and how old is it, right? And you can correlate that with logs to see when was the last time it was used, right? When was the last time somebody actually read this? So you can get into corner cases there where, you deploy an app where it was pushed out once and never read thereafter, right? But, I don't care about that stuff. That's the stuff that I want to find and break, right? Because I don't want anyone to be doing it that way. Again, in test beds, right? We proof all this stuff before we just, send these approaches to prod. But yeah, you have to understand your usage patterns, right? So if you're doing a blue-green rollout and you know that things are getting read from Vault or they're being read with some regularity, right? You say, all right, I know my policy, right, says I should be rotating this once a week or once every 2 days, or, whenever I feel like it, right? You could set a random timer on your phone, that chaos engineering bit where it's like, wake up at 3 a.m. and it's like, oh, I'm going to rotate a secret now just to see what happens, right? I don't recommend that, but you could, yeah, you need that backup data of, before I do this, let's do a sanity check and make sure that, I know when the last time this was read, I know what all the consumers are, right? I should have a reasonable idea of what's going to happen before I actually pull the trigger and do it. And if you don't, do it during business hours, right? During a regular test where if something goes wrong, somebody will be able to call you and let you know that you got it wrong, right? Or that something's messed up, and then, drop it and move on to recovery, right? Fix the thing that's broken and then figure out why it went wrong.
So I'm wondering if there's like any best practices or specific things you're telling application developers as they go, because this is all good strategy, like building timers. That's thinking blue-green, speaking in their language. But are there any like best practices like you just wish developers would just adopt so you make it easier to swap out things at runtime?
Yeah. So first of all, when you're writing an app, assume I want to change your credential at runtime without rebooting your whole thing, right? Like, here's a good example is identity certificates, right? For any client that's communicating that has to present an identity certificate for like mutual TLS. Certificates have times built into them, right? So I don't have a choice. I need to change it, right? I would prefer to update my certificate on my file system, right? And have your app just pick it up, right? I don't even want to have to tell you that I have a new certificate. I want you to just pick it up the next time you do a network, a handshake or something, right? If you don't do that, right, give me a callback mechanism, built in that I can say when you're starting a new network connection or you're loading a certificate, right? Don't just, have a file path or whatever that you read once. Give me a callback function that I can do whatever I want to do to get my new certificate loaded into your library or something. While we're on the subject, don't hide credential related logs in debug, right? If I have to turn on terabytes of debug logs to find out that my certificate expired and your retry or your reread mechanism didn't work the way I thought it did, so, you didn't actually read my new cert or something, that's a problem, right? That should be very high up in like the error or the critical logs that there's a credential related issue. My app, the code doesn't know what to do, or tell me what it's doing, right? Is it retrying? Is it crashing, right? Let me configure some of that behavior if we can, right? If you have like a retry mechanism built in, let me tune how often it tries, right? How long it should wait, right? So if timing is important, right? Let's say that I have a certificate that expires, in 90 days or whatever, that's what the industry is moving towards, is like 90-day certs, right? If I start my retry mechanism at like 70 days or whatever, 20 days early, right? Let me tune. It's like, well, okay, if it failed for some reason, I couldn't get a new cert. Don't just retry immediately and just start spamming whatever my cert issuance API is, right? Let me control, I want you to back off, right? Wait for an hour and try again, or wait, 30 minutes and then, wait for an hour. Give me a jitter mechanism that I can control, right? Or, exponential versus linear back off, right? These things all sound very tedious, right? But they are extremely important when you start getting into high performance applications where like latency matters, right? And don't just swallow the errors, right? The number of commercial applications that just swallow the errors and don't tell you anything's wrong, and they just start, spewing out nonsense about, red herring error messages about why it doesn't work. That I can't debug that, right?
Yeah. I actually ran into that today trying to get OBS to do something, and it just gave me an error message of just a red X, and I was like, well, that's not helpful. I can't Google that red X. No, but that's really important. Making meaningful error messages, I think that's across the board, as just a default start. But you bring up like a really good point there. If it's high performance, then yeah, you do need to account for these things. This is no longer, oh, it slowed us down and getting this feature to production, and maybe someone will click it. No, this is mission critical. These apps have to stay up. So it's time we take all that into consideration as far as, let's never forget the A and CIA triad is availability. If it's not up and running, you have failed security somehow. Or maybe it's something else. But anyway, thanks very much for being here. Let's start wrapping things up today. If people wanted to get more information about basically these design patterns and everything else you've laid down today, what's the best way for them to follow you or Viasat or get more information from you?
So I'm a bit of a digital hermit. So I'm old school and I use email. If you want to reach me, you can hit me up at my old school email, Kent07, KENT07 at bt.edu. Viasat has our corporate webpage, has a few sections in there on our various cybersecurity missions, which if you're interested, you can check those out. We've also got a career section if you're interested in seeing what opportunities we have. Yeah, and I think the BSides presentation that I gave is up on YouTube now. I don't know if they've segmented it into the individual clips yet.
I don't think they have quite yet, but they have all of day one in Passwords Con, which is where we were up.
Mm-hmm.
By the time this comes out, maybe they will have. So we will put a link down to either the space or the exact timestamp, because I've been sending that to multiple people already, or the link there. We'll put that down the link. But yeah, now everybody's favorite part of the show. Kezar, take it away.
Yes, we like to play this game in every episode of the Security Repo podcast, and in my personal opinion, it's the most important question ever. What is the best security advice you can give to someone today?
So I'm going to give two items here, one professional and one personal. So the best professional advice I've ever gotten is, it is not when, or it's not if you will be breached, it is when you will be breached, right? I think we just saw like one of those like 300 million social security numbers just got out, right? The largest passwords dump ever has just been made. It's like, billions, right? This stuff is everywhere, right? So when you're designing infrastructure, it is never if, it is never a backup plan, right? If you will be breached, it is when you will be breached. How quickly are you going to be able to recover, right? Speed is everything. And that, I think, is the genesis of this entire conversation we had, is that I should be able to change secrets whenever I want for whatever reason, because I'm not going to wait until the maintenance window if a ransomware actor or somebody starts banging on my door and says, hey, I nabbed your secrets manager, right? Like I've got it all, pay me, right? I'm just going to go rotate everything. The best personal advice I ever got was something I'm breaking right now, is never give out your real name online. I think that's, I don't want to sound like an old, codger about social media, right? But it's like, privacy is important, and people very quickly disregard, I think, how much we give away these days. So, just be sensitive about what you give out. And if you don't have to give out your real name, don't.
No,
Okay.
Definitely. That's definitely something that the younger generation should be doing, right?
Something like that. I don't know. Just be judicious.
Yeah. What's the worst security advice you've ever had?
So I'm very grateful to work with people that I think are pretty on the ball about security. So I'm thankfully, I've never gotten anything at a job or in school or anything that was just blatantly bad. But I do want to call out, I have used services, right? Like signed up for accounts at places where their password requirements, like the very basics, are just, awful, right? It's like minimum 6 characters, no special character requirement, right? Or even worse, like maximum 12 characters, right? For like insurance companies or banks, right? And,
Yes.
all that tells me is that your database is from like 1990 and you put a 12 character limit and you've never changed it, right?
You're being generous with 1990.
Yeah, whatever. Like, you're asking for it, right? You're not even doing the due diligence there. So anytime a company tells you, or anybody tells you that that's okay, it is not, right? Regardless of conversations around password cracking and, NIST standards about changing and stuff, it's, length is everything, right? And complexity is important. So do the basics.
Oh, that is, yeah. I mean, ultimately, all the bad advice, we can think of the opposite, and it becomes good advice. Use very long passwords that you can use, or the longest you can use. I always get mad when I just ran into that with my hotel online version. I can get it set however long I want, so it's like 20 some characters, and then I go to their online portal or their app, and the app actually limits the number of characters I can put in the password field, so I can't use my own password that the rest of the application is. Like, what? I'm not going to file a ticket on that. I'm sure someone else has, but I'll just reset the password. It'll be fine. But thanks again for coming on today and sharing your knowledge with us. This has been absolutely fantastic. Hopefully very useful to the audience out there. We'll put the links to the articles you mentioned and your talk down in the show notes. Kezar, anything else you want to say before we get out of here?
No, I honestly just want to thank Kent, of course, for coming onto the show. And, from a fellow security professional, I just want to, commend you on all the efforts you're doing. The challenges that you've mentioned today definitely are something that I have had the chance of working on in the past on other companies than Good Guardian and at Good Guardian as well, of course. So it's quite interesting for me to see that we both have kind of the same ideas, the same challenges, even though we're working miles apart with the Atlantic Ocean between us. So a great job on everything you're doing, and thanks for coming onto the show.
Thank you both for having me.
All right, thank you.